Good morning. I guess our party last night wasn't fun enough and we didn't serve enough liquor. But welcome. Thank you very much for joining us so early in the morning on a Friday, the last day of our conference, and I hope this will start off something interesting and exciting for you. You know, in July this year, Bob Woodward's book, Fear Trump in the White House, was launched. And of course, we hear about the mysterious writer of that editorial in the New York Times. Well, 44 years earlier, in June 1974, Woodward and Bernstein launched their All the President's Men. That was 2 months before Nixon resigned. And 2 years after that, he wrote with Bernstein, The Final Days, which was, of course, recording the last days of President Richard Nixon in office. There was no dispute at all at that time that whatever the Washington Post wrote or the New York Times reported on was the truth. It was joked then that you wouldn't believe that the end of the world had come if Uncle Walter Cronkite had not reported the event on CBS Evening News. Indeed, in the 60s and 70s, Walter Cronkite was often cited as the most trusted man in the United States. Well, that was a long time ago. Such was the media then, and today we're going to discuss media and trust, as if these two terms live in contradiction. The internet has made publishers of us all, has made television station managers and producers of us all, and even though some of the messages and pictures that are put out are inaccurate or even outright lies, it is not the internet that is at fault. It is how we have learned to abuse it. Well, to tease out the intricacies and the complexities of this important issue, we have invited some very distinguished names from the world of the media to come and speak to you this morning, both in the traditional and in the new media. Gerard Baker is the editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal. Warren Fernandez, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times. Victor Mallet, the Asia News editor of Financial Times. And Maria Ressa, formerly of CNN, now the executive editor and CEO of Rappler, a social news network based in the Philippines. And to keep all these guys under control, we've invited Stephen Salyer, the CEO of the Salzburg Global Seminar, whose previous incarnation was a broadcaster on public radio in the US and at Channel 13, WNET in New York City. Can we welcome the panel, please?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your opening remarks, Wing. I'm Stephen Salyer, the president of the Salzburg Global Seminar. Since 1947, a global convener itself and strategy incubator located in Austria. Among the topics we consider information policy and practice, and like our panelists, I spent about 25 years of my life working in public and private media before joining Salzburg as its president. So this topic is one that's very close to my own interests and heart. To some degree, I think everyone in the room recognizes there has always been propaganda, fake news, campaigns to discredit or enhance the reputation of people who we either see it in our interest to promote or to discredit. In a time of proliferating social media, however, and organized attacks to influence political outcomes, how to establish the accuracy of information we rely on to make informed decisions is becoming a global concern. To help make sense of this and to examine what we might do to redress it, we're pleased to have with us 4 leading media figures, each of whom has a great deal to say on the subject. We have Gerard Baker, editor-at-large, The Wall Street Journal, Warren Fernandez, editor-in-chief of the Straits Times, Victor Mallet, Asia News editor for the Financial Times, and to my far left, Ressa, CEO and executive editor for Rappler, Incorporated. So to get us started, I'm going to go first to Maria. Could you briefly describe what's happening in the Philippines and how you are wrestling with those phenomena at Rappler?
Sure. There are a few slides because a lot of it is data, so that this way you know where we're coming from. But essentially, I'll start with how can we have 2 different versions of reality? One in the real world, one in the virtual world. And let's pull up the first slide. The top one is the Pew Global Attitude Survey. It was a survey done January this year where people in the real world were asked, what do you think of traditional media in the Philippines? And 86% said that they felt traditional media was, quote, fair and accurate. The bottom one is the Edelman Trust Survey. And when you asked the people on social media, what do you think of traditional media? 83%, that big red bar, said they distrust traditional media. So how can you have both of these? Well, we looked at the data, and what the data showed us is this. So first understand, the Philippines is 97% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. Facebook is the internet. When I told Mark Zuckerberg that fact, he said, but Maria, what are the other 3% doing? And I said, well, here we go. So what we did in Rappler was to pull together a database of the attacks on media from Facebook. And I called it the Shark Tank. And you can see from January 2015 until April 2017, bayaran means corrupt. And then bias. Those 2 main ones I zoomed in on because when you look at it, you can see the impact of technology. These kind of exponential attacks to a certain point, when a lie is told 1,000,000 times, it's truth, because truth will never get a chance to catch up. And I think that's what you see in the red, right? By April 2016, our elections to elect President Duterte, our presidential elections were May 2016. So you can see it started, and then by the time after elections, by July, the beginning of the drug war, July 2016, you see the attack solidify against traditional media. This is a reality in many parts of the world. Freedom House said in November of 2017 that in 30 of 65 countries they looked at, cheap armies on social media rolled back democracy. So let me just show you the database before I turn it back to Stephen. This is our very rudimentary UX for my social media team. Imagine when real people have to deal with these attacks. In October last year, October 2016, so I've been dealing with this for 2 years, I was getting an average of 90 hate messages per hour. Right? So take a look at what my social media team looks at. This is data from Facebook. On the left, you see the URLs of websites that are fake news sites. The middle are the Facebook pages, and then you can see the average reposting time. The time when they really attacked Rappler was October 2016, because I wrote 2 of a 3-part series that looked at the propaganda machine. That's what I called it. And here you go. Take a look at October 2016. That's the database. I just want to show you what one account looks like. Sally Matay, who reposts 17.5 times, right? This is what this account posts, this Facebook account. And you can see that this is a cut and paste account, right? And then where does this Facebook account post? Inside these pages. And if you look at them, they're the campaign pages of the Duterte campaign as well as Bongbong Marcos campaign pages. So every single square there is a day and the number of posts on that page per day of this one Facebook. During this series, we also looked at how 26 fake accounts can spread to, we spent 3 months counting before we handed it to the machine, to 3 million others. So 26 fake accounts to 3 million others. If you remember in the French elections, Facebook took down 30,000 fake accounts. Imagine what impact that would have. I'll end with this. This is data from an attack on our vice president, Leni Robredo. Our president and vice president don't belong to the same party. She was attacked in January 2017. When you look at the data like this, it doesn't mean anything, right? But you can take the data and map the vector of who attacked and which accounts had the most, created the content. So this is the same network that attacked journalists. It is the same network that attacks anyone who questions extrajudicial killings. And it is so organized that it's broken down by demographic. On the bottom left, for the motherland, is a pseudo-intellectual account that takes care of you guys, of us. Thinking Pinoy is a middle-class content creator. And then Mocha Uson blog is a sexy singer-dancer, mass base, and this is the foundation of our information ecosystem. In April of 2017, our sexy singer-dancer was appointed to head social media for the Philippines. She heads social media for the presidential palace. This is our ecosystem today. I think you may hear from them about, what media looks like in other parts of the world. In our part of the world, in Indonesia and the Philippines, media was where you went, because our institutions are so weak, you went to journalists for some sense of justice. When you cripple that, the voice with the loudest megaphone wins and is able to control the public narrative.
Thank you very much, Maria. We want to emphasize we're not picking on any particular geography in this conversation, but I think to get beyond the generalities of fake news and so much of what we tend to hear and talk about, we are going to try to use some examples so that we can understand what is actually happening and what might be done to address it. I want to turn to Warren next. Warren, I know in some of the pre-conversation that we had that while we're all at times dispirited by the way we see media being undercut and fractionalized, or at least those of us who work in media, you see some positive signs. You see social media opening up some opportunities. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm generally a glass half full person rather than a glass half empty person, so maybe that's why. But we took a decision early this year to put much of our content behind a premium paywall. And obviously, in this day and age, to take a decision like that, it's not something you do lightly. And we've seen since then our subscription numbers rise. And month on month, we're getting more and more people signing up for subscriptions. And this is an interested audience who's coming to us from Singapore, from the region, and even from the United States, all around the world. And when we monitor the audience, it's not just an older audience, it includes many young people who are interested in what's going on around them. So that's a hopeful sign. And each time there's a big news story, whether it's the Kim-Trump summit in Singapore or the Malaysian elections, these are big, serious issues. We see our traffic shoot through the roof. So for me, that's an important sign, because what it says is people are seeking out information to help them make sense of what's going on in the world. And Maria mentioned the Edelman Trust Barometer. Even though trust in the media is down in most countries across the world, trust in journalism actually went up. And what that says to me is that people are looking for voices and people who they think are reliable and have credibility, and they are willing to pay for good quality content. So as I see it, the challenge that we face in the media is not so much a readership challenge, it's a revenue challenge. If I compare myself with my predecessors as editor-in-chief of the Straits Times, we are reaching more people across our platforms throughout the day. My predecessors had just one point of contact with their audience in the morning when the newspaper landed on their doorsteps. I have multiple points of contact with my audience, on their phones, on their tablets, on their desktops, on our radio stations, through our books, through events like these. And that's I think, applies to all of our publications. The audience is there. The key question is, how do you fund good journalism? And I think that's important because in any discussion about fake news, good journalism has to be part of that answer. And what do I mean by good journalism? Very simply, the purposeful pursuit of information in a balanced and objective sort of way. And I think that's critical because you can't have a good discussion, a good debate about the many, many challenges that we all face without a good flow of information. That's just fundamental to everything we try to do in a democracy. So to me, fake news, put in its simplest form, is a challenge to our democracy. And the answer to that must be a way to fund good journalism. That, to me, is the fundamental issue. If you look at the business model for journalism, it has been, for much of the 19th and 20th century, one where journalism was funded by a mix of advertising and, to a much smaller extent, subscriptions. We are now having to shift that balance back to subscriptions in order to fund that journalism. And the fundamental business model has changed because so much of the advertising is being mopped up by the likes of Google and Facebook. And unless we can sort out the business case, I'm speaking to an audience of CEOs, so I think this should resonate with you. Unless you sort out that business case for good journalism, we are not going to be able to deal with the issue of fake news. And that's my one line proposition. You get the fundamental business model for this right. And getting it right is not just a job for us journalists or media managers of media organizations. It's a societal challenge. It's a challenge for business leaders. It's a challenge for government leaders and community leaders.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn next to Victor. We've heard the first two speakers both refer to the word democracy, and obviously not all of the world operates under the same political systems. And you work from Hong Kong, where there is a great deal of change underway, and yet Hong Kong has always been a city and a place where open access to information has been very important to the culture and to the economy. And I'm wondering whether you feel that these conditions can be maintained and what the role of the media itself is in Hong Kong and trying to make sure that continues to be the case.
Absolutely. I mean, it's why we and a lot of other news organizations have our headquarters there. By the way, I just wanted to say on the issue of fake news, did anyone see that wonderful interview with the Russian military intelligence agents this morning? I mean, I thought that was magnificent. The Russian TV interview with these guys desperately trying to remember interesting facts about early English church architecture. I mean, it was magnificent. But I also just want to quickly say how much I agree with Warren on that. I mean, you know, I don't think trust in, and you in fact, I don't think trust in traditional media has really gone down at all. If you look at what happens, I mean, I'm British, and certainly the British traditional media in print before the invention of the internet was in many ways pretty rubbishy. You know, there were a lot of tabloids that were full of inaccuracies and essentially full of fake news, and I don't think that's got any worse. What's happened is that social media has kind of weaponized fake news and made it so much more accessible to so many more people. So the accuracy hasn't changed. What's changed really is I think, the medium. And almost all the rubbish, the sort of angry opinions you see on Twitter, all the kind of extremism on Facebook, all that, you know, Trump's tweets, they're all based usually on a straightforward news report by a traditional journalist. Could be someone from Reuters, could be someone from the Financial Times, the New York Times, Agence France Presse, AP, the Philippine Daily Inquirer, even the Wall Street Journal. You know, these, I mean, the Singapore Straits Times. I mean, all these sort of facts that are commented on angrily by everybody actually are usually reported by straightforward traditional journalists. I think it's important to remember that. On the issue of Hong Kong, yes, I mean, Hong Kong is still, you know, one of the best places to be a journalist and to have your headquarters. But I happen to be on the board of the Foreign Correspondents Club, and I happen to be acting president when our president was away, when we had invited a young politician called Andy Chan, who supports the independence of Hong Kong. And this guy was pretty much unknown. His party was unknown. It's called the Hong Kong Independence Party. until the Chinese government persuaded the Hong Kong government to ban his party. I think this would have been the first time a political party had been banned in the history of certainly post-97 Hong Kong. So everyone got interested in it. The local papers wrote stories, we wrote a story, other people wrote stories, and as the Foreign Correspondents Club, we decided to invite this guy to speak. The storm, the ensuing storm, was absolutely unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it in my life. Essentially, the Chinese government tried to force us to change our minds and to disinvite him, which, of course, as we told them, was never going to happen. But it created a huge storm. There were massive protests. We got a lot of criticism. We were attacked by pro-Beijing Hong Kong politicians. But I think, the good news is that we obviously decided the event was completely legal. We have people of all different opinions speaking. Some of them are pro-Beijing, some of them are anti-Beijing, and so on. And we decided that the event had to go ahead because it wasn't illegal. And actually, interestingly, the response from the local media was intriguing because there is a lot of self-censorship in Hong Kong. But I think they kind of stepped up to the plate because they realized that this was a bit of a moment where if an organization like ours had decided not to hold an event simply because we had been told not to by the Chinese government, even though it was legal, that would set a very, very bad precedent for Hong Kong. And in fact, embarrassingly, during this whole process, there was an article in the Singapore Straits Times analyzing the loss of freedoms in Hong Kong and the loss of press freedom in particular. And I thought, I used to work in Southeast Asia 20 years ago, and I thought, this is really embarrassing because 20 years ago, it would have been the Hong Kong press writing about the loss of freedoms of the press in Singapore, and now it's the other way around. And I think that was a sort of significant moment for me because in Asia, including in Hong Kong, press freedoms are under an enormous amount of pressure. Ironically for the Chinese, Taiwan is probably one of the freest places to be a journalist in Asia at the moment. Obviously Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. But in East Asia and even in South Asia, it's getting much more difficult than it used to be. Places like Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines are traditionally were places where you could freely exercise journalism, and they're becoming much more difficult.
Thank you. I'd like to hit the ball over to Jerry next. And Jerry, we've talked about weaponized social media. We've talked about different kinds of pressures on stories and reporting. But are there other factors that you see that you think are going to be extremely important in restoring trust with audiences where it needs to be restored?
Yes, thank you very much, Steve. I do. I'm going to take a slightly different view from that of my esteemed colleagues here. This is not, it won't be surprising to many of you, but there is a view, I think most journalists seem to have, that there's really nothing wrong with the journalism at all. It's really not the journalists' fault. We are going about our business, just as Victor just said, doing these perfectly good, straight, objective pieces of reporting. And these various malefactors around the world, these sort of deeply evil figures, whether it's Russians or Facebook or President Duterte or President Trump, are making it all up and just suddenly saying this is unacceptable and terrible journalism and it can't be trusted. I take a different view from that. Let me say two things first, straight off. Firstly, most journalists go about their job in a serious and I think rigorous way and try to do their very best. And they work very hard and they really try to report the news as they find it. And I certainly think no one could challenge, especially at a time like today, how important journalism is. Second thing to say is that the attacks on the media by the likes of President Duterte and President Trump are deplorable. It's absolutely unacceptable for people in positions of such authority as the President of the United States to describe the press as the enemy of the people. That kind of language in an atmosphere of heightened tension generally about politics and media is extremely inflammatory and unacceptable. But we do have to look as journalists at ourselves and ask why it is that trust in what we do has declined so much. And again, I take issue with Victor here. Let me just, I can speak mainly for the United States, but I know a fair amount about Britain too, having grown up there. But let me talk about the United States in particular, which is obviously where so much of this issue about trust and fake news and everything else comes from. There was a poll this week, actually, just taken by the Gallup for the Knight Foundation, absolutely in line with pretty well all the other polls we've seen in the last couple of years about people's attitudes towards the media. Very comprehensive poll, probably the most comprehensive one taken so far. It found that 69% of respondents said that their trust, that they had declined, their trust in the media had declined over the last 10 years. Strikingly, 4% said their trust in the media had increased. Within that, 69%, as it happens, 94% of Republicans said their trust in the media had declined. 75%, interestingly, of independents said their trust in the media had declined. Democrats were slightly smaller. I think about 40% said their trust had declined, but that was still larger than the number of said that their trust had increased. Why do we think that why do we think that so many people in the United States have expressed so much distrust in the media? Look, you can take the view that it's all because of fake news has suddenly come along, or Facebook is acting as a channel for all kinds of bad actors, or again maybe it's political leaders who are attacking the media. I think we have to look at ourselves, and the fact is, this dissatisfaction with the media in the United States, in Britain, certainly much of the West, has come about because people see that news as predominantly biased in one direction. They see it, and has been, whether the major networks in the United States, the major print news organizations, increasingly with digital news organizations in the last 20 years, the same trend is there too. The vast majority of those news organizations tend to have journalists that have a particular worldview, and they tend to be significantly left of center. Polls of journalists taken in the United States suggest somewhere upwards of 80–90% of journalists in the United States vote Democrat. That's almost certainly broadly reflected too in other countries. Journalists tend to be to the left of center. They have a left of center worldview. They think government is the solution to most people's problems. They tend to be skeptical about, they tend to be very progressive on social issues like abortion and gun rights in the United States and gay marriage. They tend to be pretty skeptical about the use of American power around the world. They have a pretty well-established, what could be very clearly described as progressive left of center worldview. And again, I'm not accusing them of deliberately promoting that worldview in their reporting. It just so happens if you have that worldview, the kind of priorities that you that you will bring to your reporting, to your editing, the kind of worldview that you will that will inform the way in which you go about your job and the stories you choose to do and the way in which you choose to talk to people and the people you choose to talk to will reflect that worldview. And that is why people have become, especially conservatives, have become so dissatisfied with the bulk of the media in the United States and in much of the world. And that's at core the problem. The problem is that, and that's, by the way, that's one of the reasons why in the United States so many of these kind of right-wing media organizations have cropped up, like Breitbart, because they offer an alternative from the monolithically left-of-center worldview that most journalists present in the major traditional news organizations. And for journalists, the task for us is to examine ourselves, to examine how we do journalism, how we do reporting, who we're recruiting, what do newsrooms look like. There was an amazing statistic published recently that in the United States that of the major news organizations, the major national news organizations, something like 80% of journalists worked in either the New York City, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, or Los Angeles metropolitan areas. Those tend to be sort of hermetically sealed liberal environments where everybody there tends, again, to have the same worldview. There are very few journalists from the middle of the country, very few journalists from Kansas or from Colorado or from Alabama. And again, the same is true major metropolitan centers in the UK and in Europe, and I'm sure it's true also elsewhere in Asia. So again, no one will ever defend some of the disgraceful remarks and attacks that are made on the media, and we need to be clear about that. But we have got to do, journalists have got to do, news organizations have got to do a better job of making sure that our journalism is genuinely objective and doesn't reflect one particular worldview.
Victor, you want to take it on?
Well, I just don't agree that the media has been dominated by the left. If you look at the UK, Australia, and now the US, where Rupert Murdoch, your ultimate boss, I guess, is it's actually quite heavily dominated by the right. I mean, I think only in the sort of weird world of US politics could the US media be described as left-wing. Of course, in American terms, perhaps CNN is seen as left-wing. To a European, CNN seems, quite right of center. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's all kind of moved. It's all moved to the right. But where Jerry is absolutely right, I think, is not in the terrible sort of dominance of the left liberal media, but in the fact that we in the traditional media, all of us actually, have failed to kind of report from the heartlands of our countries, and this very much applies in Britain with Brexit. The failure to understand what ordinary people thought in Felixstowe or the north of England about Europe and about immigration, and the same obviously was true of Trump, which is why so few people predicted Trump's victory. You're absolutely correct that we have been living in these not so much liberal bubbles but metropolitan bubbles in places like London, and we have failed to get out into the heartland of America, the heartland of Europe certainly, and the heartland of the UK to understand what ordinary people are thinking. And if we had done that better, we would have been much better prepared and able to analyze the Trump phenomenon and the Brexit phenomenon.
We seem to have hit a nerve a little bit, at least with our panelists. So we're going to throw this out to the audience in a few minutes. So if you have a question, be preparing to answer that, to ask that. But
could I just jump in? I mean,
please.
I'm half agreeing with both my colleagues on the panel and half disagreeing as well, because I think most journalists try to get to the reality and the truth. What has happened, I think, is the disconnect we've allowed to emerge with the community. And I think readers, the community, wants to see journalists as being one of them, reflecting their views and their concerns. So if you're living in Singapore and there's a huge breakdown on the train stations, they want to see that reflected and analyzed. And it goes back to that whole issue of credibility. Do you reflect the reality on the ground? And as soon as journalists stop doing that, you open the door to criticisms like we're hearing from established leaders of the lack of trust. And we must never allow that to happen.
Yes.
I'll jump in a little bit. I'll take all three guys and kind of wrap and then pull it forward. I think number one, the biggest change for all of us has been technology. This exponential growth, the fact that we are no longer the gatekeepers, the fact that while we create content, now the world's largest distributor of news are the social media platforms, American tech companies. Where I agree with Jerry, there are two books that I would recommend that are just coming out now, and I'd spent time with both of these authors. Yochai Benkler from the Berkman Klein Internet Institute supports Jerry's position, which is it isn't Russian disinformation based on the data that they've gotten. It is the fact that media is so polarized, but where social media plays a role in this is it also plays to the worst of human nature. It's the cognitive biases that have pulled it. It does have some very interesting findings about the conservative view and the difference in who believes in fake news. Alan Rusbridger just released his book in Great Britain last Friday. And in his book, he's taken our position, which is the platforms, the social media platforms, have taken our business. In Great Britain, 97% of new digital ad spend is going to Google and Facebook. So it's sucking all the oxygen of our business models. We have no business model now if you're still looking at advertising. At the same time, it is also the platform's inability to replicate the kinds of accountability rules that we had as gatekeepers in traditional media when we could control that flow of information. It's the platform's inability to actually hold these bad actors to account, including people, real people. So what I showed you was something being called, now called patriotic trolling, online state-sponsored hate that is aimed to silence any critical views. And this is happening in many parts of the world. Ironically, the parts where, Global South, where the platform's inactions actually mean people will die, right? Myanmar, for example, Facebook decided to take out to ban military generals, the top general. Anyway, I don't want to take up more time, but I think those 2 books, I just started reading Alan Rusbridger's book, super, a great way of looking at where we are today. Well, what's clear is this is a time of creative destruction, and you guys play such a huge role in determining how information flow is going to, what it's going to become in the future.
Well, looking at the sign here, I feel a little bit like I did when I arrived in Singapore, having lost Monday and the air. A bunch of minutes disappeared from our clock. So we're down to the closing minutes here. So I do want to be able to give the audience a chance to have some questions. If anyone has been thinking hard, someone back here, I think we have a microphone we can bring to you. If you would maybe say your name and identify yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm Doug Mellinger from New York. As a business person, as an investor, I understand the companies need to ultimately make a profit. And the news organizations are obviously for-profit companies, so therefore you need to make a profit. Trump seems to me to be the greatest thing that's ever happened to you guys, because it's just, he gives you content 24 hours a day. And the content is all negative, and so it creates all kinds of chaos. The word trust is interesting to me, and I'd love your perspective, because you can look at it from 2 ways. One is, I talk to people all the time, all over the United States, about where they get their knowledge, their content from. And they trust implicitly the organization or organizations that they're consuming content from, and completely mistrust the other ones, because there is such a polarization and such a bias. And so you could make the argument that everyone trusts, and trust is up, because if you ask them the right question, you're going to get that answer.
Yeah, exactly.
If you ask them about the other side, you're going to get a complete mistrust, because I know exactly what they're going to think if I ask them, are they watching CNN, are they watching Fox, or are they watching MSNBC, or are they reading Wall Street Journal versus New York Times? So, I think that this issue, and I also just feel that the media is not taking enough self-reflection.
Can we get a question from you? You're making a very good point, but...
No, I just love to get your perspective on that. I think the way you've presented it, you're right and wrong.
I think the point you're making is about echo chambers. In a print newspaper, you had this wonderful thing called serendipity. You would open the paper, and the stories would be chosen by the editors, that's people like me and Jerry, and you would read the paper, and you would often see something that you weren't expecting to see. But if you have a news feed, and that would be interesting and important to you. If you had a news feed, it tends to be things you want to read already. As you're saying, you watch the media that you already want to watch. And therefore, you do get channel. I mean, how many friends do I have on Facebook who support Trump? Very, very few, possibly 1 or 2 out of several 100,000, whatever. Same with Brexit. How many Brexit supporting friends do I have on Facebook? Almost none. I have an echo chamber where I only get the views of people that I already agree with. Whereas in a newspaper, a sort of old-fashioned print newspaper, had this wonderful advantage that you could see things that you weren't expecting to see, that would maybe be uncomfortable for you, but would be interesting and important, and you would read them, because it would tell you something you didn't want to know, but you needed to know. And that I think, is what we've lost with social media, is everything tends to get channeled into one direction. And maybe that's happening with traditional media becoming polarized as well, which is very worrying if true. If CNN is becoming more left and Fox is becoming more right, that would be disturbing if traditional media started to go the way of social media.
We have another question here, the middle, and then maybe over here and here. You try to keep them brief, that would be great. We'll be able to.
No, I don't need a mic. My question is, we know you have a problem. Media has. We know we have a trust issue. What's the answer? What do we do? We talked around the subject. The President Trump saying fake news, fake news, fake news. If you deliver that message long enough, children will begin to understand and believe it.
Right.
And that's all they hear. How do you combat it?
People do believe. I mean, again, I want to be careful. It's not. We really have to be careful. It's not all because people. We've got the causality the wrong way around here. People People haven't stopped trusting the media because Donald Trump came along. They didn't trust the media, and that's why Donald Trump came along. I mean, quite frankly, I would actually argue that distrust in the media was one of, if not the single most important issue for so many Trump voters in 2016. And instead of just kind of dismissing it and saying they're all stupid or they're all being led by Fox News or by Russians or by fake news or whatever, we need to understand why that is. And again, it is very striking. You talk to conservatives, to Republicans in America, the one thing that unites, they disagree about Trump for a start, they disagree about taxes, they disagree about immigration, they disagree about trade. One thing they absolutely are united about is their absolute distrust and distaste for traditional media. And that's, so the answer, what have we got to do? A part of it lies in looking closely at the type of people who work for our news organizations, making sure that we do have a great, there's so much emphasis on diversity in the United States, gender diversity, sexual orientation diversity, racial diversity. There is absolutely no interest whatsoever in most newsrooms in ideological diversity or in thought diversity, because they all think exactly alike. And with great respect to Victor, whom I like and admire, he just absolutely made my point for him. All his friends on Facebook think Brexit is a terrible idea. Well, all the journalists in the New York Times newsroom, I almost guarantee you, their friends all think Donald Trump is the worst thing that's ever happened to the United States. They may be right, but we do need to understand that there are people out there who have different views, and we need to make sure that we are at least in touch with people who have those different views. We need to go for more diverse newsrooms. We need to create a more diverse environment, a more intellectually and ideological diverse environment than currently exists in our news organizations.
Let's get one more question over here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul Grunwald from S&P. Question, I think, for Jerry as well. You mentioned the point resonated, 80 to 90% of journalists are Democrats. They cluster in New York, Boston, San Francisco, as do most of the people in this room probably. But we started the session by harking back
Anybody from Kansas here?
Walter, well, that's the question. Harking back to Walter Cronkite in the 60s. If we go back and look at that era, did we have a better balance between Republicans and Democrats, and were journalists spread across the U.S. and Kansas in places, or what really has changed since that period in this?
No, we didn't. I mean, two things. One, I think two things have changed. Firstly, until about the 1960s, and certainly it was intensified by Watergate, journalists were very different sort of creatures in the United States, and indeed in the UK and I think in Europe. They were traditionally, it was a craft. Journalism was a craft where people quite often didn't go to university. They weren't especially highly educated. They would often, leave school at 16 and go and become journalists, and they would train to be journalists, and their job was to find out what happened. That's all. That's what they did. Beginning in the 1950s and 60s, journalism became kind of like a profession which attracted the smartest people from the smartest universities, again, intensified by Watergate. It wasn't enough for them to go and find out what happened. They wanted to tell people what to think. And that's when journalism changed. So that changed. Secondly, from that period, 60s, 70s, we did have, it began to become monolithically, or ideologically monolithic. What happened, what changed is, those were the only news organizations we had. Back in the 1960s and 70s, you got your news from Walter Cronkite or the New York Times. That was it. And then they were the voice of authority, the voice of God in the United States. The BBC alone was the voice of authority, the voice of God in Britain. Beginning really then again when the internet came along and people were able to have other choices and talk radio and alternative satellite TV came along, people were able to find channels to express different views. So those are the things that have changed. The nature of journalism itself has changed, the nature of journalists has changed, and the environment and the distribution channels that we get journalism from has also changed.
Yeah, I mean, the thing you missed was local newspapers, city newspapers, local newspapers, in America in particular, but also in other countries, have basically disappeared. And that is a huge loss. It means the town hall is not being reported, and it means, as Jerry says, that people are not understanding what's going on in the heartland.
With apologies on the question still to be raised with 2 minutes to go, I had promised our panelists that I would give each of them about 30 seconds at the end to make a point that they didn't feel had been made in the conversation. So I want to honor that pledge. So Maria, would you like to take your 30 seconds?
For me, it is technology, and I don't think it is something that you can look at the journalists alone to solve it. This is why you have hearings going on in the United States. The tech platforms, have essentially taken mob rule as a way to distribute news, and that began, and we saw the impact globally from President Duterte's election in the Philippines. A month later, Brexit. In November, President Duterte. Doesn't mean that things have radically changed, but what has changed is power shifted from the old power, the way you in this room, the way governments conduct power, the way we journalists were part of power, to new power, machines, algorithms, and exponential spread. I think this is what we have to get right.
Thank you. Warren?
I'd go back to the point that someone asked about what are we going to do to build trust? And what I say to my colleagues in the newsroom is get out there and engage the audience, because I think the audience has changed. The audience doesn't just want to read what we're writing, they want to engage, they want to ask you questions and challenge you. And the more we're going out there and showing that we are part of the community that we're meant to serve and connected to their hopes and their dreams and their concerns about what's playing out around them, the more we will build that credibility with them, and that's how we will get their trust.
Jerry?
I'll leave on a generally positive note. Victor said earlier about glass being half full or half empty. It reminds me a little bit of somebody, I think towards the end of his days in office, Tony Blair was asked about how things were and how bad they were getting. And he said, well, I prefer to see the glass as 1/10 full rather than 9/10 empty. So I take the same view. Look, the only thing I'll say is for all this storm and stress about journalism and decline in trust in the media, which is a serious problem, and it is a really serious problem for our democracies. We really have to address it. It's not new. We have been here before. We have gone through periods where people have, had extreme distrust in media, 1930s, 1960s, way back. And so we have come through it. Sometimes it's taken a national or international crisis to get us through it. We have to focus on doing what's right. And just to end by telling you, what an old phenomenon this is. My colleagues on stage will probably have heard this one, but there was a bit of sort of doggerel by somebody, an English writer in the middle of the 19th century, who famously said, "You cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist, but seeing what the man will do unbribed, there's no occasion to."
Yes. Yes, a friend of mine used to have that on his visiting card, but he only had the first bit. Yeah, I mean, I would just say, we have to plug away at actually the best of traditional journalism. That means getting scoops. It means holding the Chinese government to account for what's happening in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs who are being held in these weird re-education camps that we're just beginning to hear about because the media have been reporting it. And also, what's going on in the Trump White House, what's going on in Brexit Britain. I mean, scoops are still the kind of lifeblood of newspapers. And we very much emphasize them on our internet site and in the newspaper. And they get readers, and I think, and of course they get commented on social media by extremists from one side or the other, but I think there's no substitute for really good reporting. One of the great things now about journalism, I think, is that in the outside world, the non-Anglo-Saxon world, the kind of language skills of the reporters today is so much greater than it was when I started 20 or 30 years ago in journalism. We would have people, or newspapers would have people in China who didn't speak Chinese, or people in the Middle East who didn't speak Arabic or Hebrew. That's completely changed now. People have bureaus full of incredibly good Chinese speakers who are producing great stories. And I think, eventually those strengths will come through, and hopefully they'll be appreciated by the readers, whether they're business readers or other readers around the world.
Well, we're getting the flashing signs to wrap up, so I do want to thank all of our panelists, and use the prerogative of the chair to make one brief comment at the close, and that is that we seem today, many of us, to hear arguments that fly in the face of just about everything that's been said by this panel, that in order to ensure economic and political stability, we need to become resigned that greater government control of the media is a necessary price that we will pay. And I think it behooves all of us to think very, very hard about what the counter-arguments to that are. And many of the people attending this meeting are, of course, involved with financial matters in terms of innovation, in terms of the necessary exchange of information for accountability and transparency, for markets to work effectively, for innovation to be spurred. All of these are things that I think press has almost been a byproduct of having open exchange of information and free press. And we've taken it for granted. And we may regret if it disappears that we took it for granted. So that would be my wrap-up comment. Thank you all for coming, and thanks very much to our panelists.
Thank you.